Welcome to Sorry Is This Boring? I'm Marika.
I'm Natalie.
This week we're talking about The Love Witch, a film that came out in 2016, directed by Bel Air. This film, it's a story that follows our protagonist named Elaine, who is a beautiful witch. She goes to this small town after the death of her husband, Jerry, and she takes it kind of by storm, using sex magic on different men to try and basically find love and find her Prince Charming. But unfortunately, most of these men are just driven mad by this magic and by these emotions. It's about what it's like to be written off as a beautiful woman in a man's world. Because Elaine, our protagonist, her ultimate goal is to find love, and she makes herself into the ultimate male fantasy and constructs her image in service of male desire, and she ultimately finds out that this is something that's unattainable.
Spoilers ahead, as per usual, so...
Yeah, but if you haven't seen the film, definitely watch it, or it won't make sense.
Well, we recommend that you do, but if you like spoilers, whatever.
So this film is a film by Bel Air, and she is 100% an auteur. This is her second feature film. Her first film was called Viva. It came out in 2007. This is her second feature. She not only wrote and directed it, she also edited it. She did production design, costume design. She was the composer. And she spent years in pre-production, handcrafting things that you see in the film. There's a scene where the protagonist is on this pentagram rug, which she herself spent months making by hand. So I feel that's something that's such a unique aspect of this film.
It's honestly ideal.
Yeah, it's ideal.
I feel like whenever, well, for those of you who don't know, we make films.
Mm-hmm.
And I always love doing the costume design and art direction and finding all of the props and everything like that, and making things if need be if you can't find them, especially in your budget. And I feel like it's so ideal to be able to sort of take control of how everything is going to look in your film, creating the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
It's so sick.
And the film itself is a recreation, aesthetically, of 60s Technicolor films. And it really does a good job at looking like it could be straight from the 60s. And the music itself is all meant to harken back to that era of films, give the audience that feeling. And Bel Air took sort of parts from a lot of other soundtracks from films from this era too. When you look up this film, it's referred to by so many different critics, even respectable film review sites, as a sexploitation film. And there I read one thing which compared it to Russ Meyer's film, and they said that she must be a big fan of Russ Myers, who's a very prolific sexploitation filmmaker. He made Valley of the Dolls and things like that. And people called her the feminist Tarantino, which is something that honestly at first I could have easily made that comparison, but just reading Bel Air's director's statement, it's insulting almost to make this comparison to sexploitation films, because these films
I don't know. I feel like that's a little bit harsh. I feel like it's definitely inspired by it aesthetically, but I think it's just misguided to be claiming that it is one. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I guess that's fair. Yeah. People are calling it this, and they're calling it pastiche, and Bel Air has rejected that it's a pastiche, and it's a sexploitation film, because like sexploitation films aren't really about women. You know, they're about
Definitely.
women in the way that like
It's
like Playboy is about women, you know?
it's like
Or
objectification.
yeah.
It's like specifically for the male gaze, you
Yeah.
know,
And that's what these films were.
and like the male fantasy
Yeah.
as well.
Sexploitation films were like from like a very specific time, and they're from like a very specific audience, and there's like a lot of people that argue that like they depict strong women. You know, there's people that argue like Hitchcock depicts strong women, and like Roman Polanski depicts strong women, but these aren't films made for women. They're made for men, and those ones specifically are made by very creepy men. It was just like the reception of this film is like very interesting, because it, I think, is like acted as like a mirror for like how people feel about not just gender, but like gender in cinema as well. So like even though on the surface there's like a lot of similarities you can see with like Tarantino films and like 60s and 70s exploitation films, like the thing that's like so different is like the emphasis. The emphasis is a woman's experience, which is what most of these films aren't about. You know, they're depicting women, but it's like not about their experience.
Yeah.
And a lot of like the critics and like the reviews for this film like show just like the big disconnect that there is between like the way we talk about film history, because film history is so dominated with films that are depicting like male interests.
Yeah, and I think that's like sort of where the idea of like it being misguided comes into play, is that there's like not much to compare it to. You know, like it clearly she has inspirations, you know.
I have a quote from Bel Air, Anna Bel Air. She said, I think what men fail to see is this phenomenon of how women are excluded from so much of cinema in terms of their fantasies, their desires, their concerns, so they don't actually understand when they see a movie that is different, that comes from a female consciousness and concerns female fantasies, how different that is. And I think that's the most interesting thing about my film in a way, how it's actually able to depict women without showing them in terms of male fantasy.
Preach.
Yeah. So I feel like that's something that like I feel like really sums up like even like my experience of watching the film with people.
So we'll just go through the movie, just talking about things that we find interesting, things that we liked, anything along that line, just sharing our feelings. So the first thing that I thought was funny and interesting was when she's driving in the car, the very first scene, and you see her, what you find out to be her ex-husband, taking a drink of something and then collapsing onto the ground, and then she talks about it immediately after as her husband leaving her, which I think is hilarious.
Yeah.
Because you have like this sort of what seems like a clear depiction of like the reality of the situation, which is like he died, and then the way that she talks about it is that he like divorced her.
Yeah,
you know?
And then she's like talking about her therapist said that like there's nothing wrong with her. People are abused all the time, every day.
And I think something about that is really interesting as well, because I feel like one thing that I feel like I have experienced throughout my life is like whatever my sort of problems or traumas or whatever that I'm dealing with always get compared when I talk about them. And I feel like that's something that we need to stop doing. And I never really thought of it as like a gendered thing in a way, but I feel like seeing it within the context of this film, of like, you know, the therapist seeming to like almost shut her down in a way, because they're like, there's people that have it worse than you and they're fine, you know, and like being able to like think about that as like, you know, something where it's just like invalidating women.
Yeah.
I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. I feel like that makes me want to like jump ahead to this other scene in the film where she's like touching herself, and like while she is, there's like stuff going through her head about like things her father said, things her ex-husband said, and she's like kind of like fantasizing about all these things, like while having this like sensual experience.
That's like the strangest scene to me.
I think it's like a very strange scene, but I also think it's like something that's like really like kind of rarely like touched on in films, is that like I think it's like a lot to do with like abuse and trauma, and like how women have to like how like it can affect like women's sexuality, because I feel like I don't know, that's the connection that I made. And it's like the idea of like getting over trauma to like feel sensual pleasure, I guess, if that makes sense, and like the connection with that.
I kind of felt like I didn't read it as her actually like getting off to these things that like are like these voices that are in her head. Like I kind of read it as like ironic sort of situation. Like I don't really know how to explain it. I kind of feel like while she was like having this like sensual experience with herself, there's like all of these just like terrible things that like men have said about her, like being overlaid.
Yeah, I mean, like it is like also like a juxtaposition, because the scene is like her, she is like, you know, once again embodying sexual male fantasy. She's like in her bed, like, you know, touching herself sensually. She like looks beautiful, and then there's like these people saying like, you're fat, like, you're worthless, and then like suddenly they start saying like she gets the male validation. They're like, oh, you're so hot now, and it is a very interesting scene.
Yeah, I guess like that what you were saying is like I saw it more as like juxtaposition than like those voices actually being like what she's thinking about while she's touching herself.
I think it definitely could be interpreted either way, and I think they're both really interesting, and they're both like really could really fit in.
So the next thing I thought was really interesting was the sort of, I felt like immediate friction between Elaine and Trish. Right after she meets her, Trish is like the kind of owner of the house.
The landlady.
The landlady. And so when she moves in and meets her, it feels like there's immediate friction and like jealousy and just like judgment. Like
they're just kind of like, oh, and they like tilt their heads like at things that the other one says, like, oh, okay.
Yeah, like when she's like, oh, I like am an interior decorator, and Elaine's just like, oh, and that's like it.
Yeah.
And then when Elaine's like, oh, I was a dancer, then Trish is like, oh, and like looks her up and down.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something that I feel like is kind of carried on throughout the film. Like, I think that Elaine, like, which is probably something I'll talk about later, like, has her own issues with, like, female companionship.
Yeah.
But I also feel like female companionship is, like, not really portrayed in any sort of, like, positive light throughout the film. Mm-hmm. Like, I feel like nobody really has, like, a relationship with each other that's, like, not... Like, the only time I feel like it's ever, like, depicted in any sort of positive way, and not even always, is, like, when they're talking about men.
Yeah.
And then there's certain times when they're talking about men that's not even positive.
Yeah. I mean, there is, like, at no point in this film where Elaine talks with a woman about something other than men.
Like, this movie 100% fails the Bechdel test.
But it does it, like, so clearly on purpose.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Like, we had a conversation about the Bechdel test recently. So it's a measure of the representation of women in fiction, and it asks whether a work features at least two women who talk to each other about something other than a man. Like, if you start to think about this in the context of things that you're watching, you'll realize that a lot of things fail this test.
Like, a surprising amount of films and TV shows fail to do this.
But at the same time, it isn't always a marker of what makes something feminist.
Yeah.
Because there are movies that that maybe don't talk about things other than men, but it has purpose to it. It's rightfully so in the context of the film.
Like this film, which is, like, undoubtedly a very feminist film. It, like, is failing this test.
Yeah. Another thing that I love about the film is that the first time that we kind of see her performing some sort of ritual, she is calling out to Goddess, and I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Just a small thing, but I thought it was really cool.
I feel like something that's, like, is, like, interesting in the film is, like, you know, like, she, like, is turned to witchcraft and, like, Wicca, and, like, I love it all, but then, like, at the head of their, like, coven is this, like, creepy man.
Oh, yeah.
I even, like, wrote down a quote. He says, like, use perfume and displays of flesh artfully to, like, get men to love you.
I mean, I wrote some stuff about that, too. Some of the things he says, like, I totally understand in. You can just totally believe him being the leader of this coven that is, like, has so many, like, female witches in it. Because, like, a lot of things he says, like, has this, like, sense of, like, feminine empowerment to it, you know? And, like, I feel like being the sort of, like, viewer, you know, having that sort of sense of, like, omniscience, you can see through some of that bullshit.
Yeah.
But, like, I can totally see, like, why so many women find, like, power through him and this coven.
Yeah.
And, like, there was, like, one thing that he said where he was saying that, like, all women, when he was talking about, like, the magic of, like, dance and sex and stuff, and he was saying that, like, all women's power lies in their sexuality. And, like, I think that that's right and wrong at the same time, you know?
And I do think that this film is, like, quite intentionally, like, exploring the archetype of the witch, like,
100%.
in terms of, like, cinema history, because, like, it is, like, actually crazy to think about how, like, the witch was, like, the symbol of, like, deviance and mass hysteria, like, became something sexy, which it is in, like, you know, sexploitation type films.
Yeah.
And, like, and I feel like witches are depicted in two ways, like, even now, as, like, either sexy or as grotesque.
But it's, like, the whole, the female, like, archetypes, like, the virgin, the mother, and the crone. It's, like, those are, like, the only things that, like, women
and it's
can
like,
be, or, like, the whore.
It's funny how, like, something that was, like, so much about, like, fear or female sexuality has, like, become female sexuality being depicted for male pleasure.
Yeah. And they even, like, talk about, like, through this sort of short lesson in the burlesque club, they talk about, like, the history of witches, you know, and how, like, their sexuality, and their, like, strive for, like, freedom of sexuality has been persecuted throughout history. And so, like, I feel like that as well, like, adds to, like, that sort of feeling of, like, feminine empowerment through, like, their sexuality. But, like, the big thing is for me, which, I mean, I believe this is probably what Bel Air was trying to do, is that, like, you're not going to get that sexual, feminine, empowerment through, like, the teachings of a man. And I feel like that's where, like, because I think there's so much validity in the lesson that he talks about, but I think, like, that's where it falls flat when he starts talking about how, like, you have to, like, have, like, in order to get men to, like, worship the goddess that is, like, within all women, like, you have to communicate with them in a language that they can understand.
Yeah.
Which, like, I think is, like, so bad, you know?
Yeah. And I think, like, you know, like, you could interpret it that, like, this magic is sort of gone wrong, which is why these, like, men she's using sex magic on keep dying. But I feel like what's, like, really wrong, and what Bel Air's trying to say, is that, like, the difference between the genders is, like, the problem. It's just, like, so, like, mismatched. you
Yeah.
know? And like these men, when they start to like feel these like female emotions, they literally die because of it and go insane.
Yeah, and I something that I find interesting within the film is that the coven that she's a part of always stresses the polarity of the genders, which is like something that I never really understood, and I think that there's like a point there, you know?
Yeah.
Like I think that like the problem is that I think genders are equal. I don't really think that like men's and women's brains or like any sort of like gender in the spectrum are like any different from each other. But I think like we live in a society that's patriarchal, and so no matter what, men and women are going to be brought up in different ways.
Yeah. That makes me think of like a quote that I read by Bel Air, which she said, first of all, like, this is a feminist film because it comes from female consciousness. And she says, women are often feminine, and that's not a bad thing to be feminine. It's just that it's been used against women. I don't think that there are any problems with femininity and feminism being used together, because if that were a problem, that would mean that we should be ashamed of somehow being a woman or being feminine. And that's a problem. It's a problem to think that feminism is about trying to be like a man. And it's horrible for women to have to be ashamed of being feminine and girls to be ashamed of themselves for being girly. I want to make a movie that is honest about what it's like to be a girl, and I think that's something that people need to think about sometimes. She also said that a lot of people have an internalized misogyny, and internalized misogyny is something that almost every woman has definitely experienced.
I wrote an essay about the Love Witch, and I was comparing it to like different psychoanalytic concepts, so I'm gonna be making reference to it probably from now on. I was sort of comparing like the way like Biller depicts like both the gender roles and like relationships to what like Jacques Lacan thinks about gender roles and relationships. Not that I think that they have like really similar views on gender roles and stuff, but I think that there's things they said that can be comparable in the within the context of the film. And so there's this quote from Lacan where he's like saying that masculinity and femininity represent two non-complementary structures defined by different relationships to the other, and there can be no such thing as a sexual relationship. And something I found interesting about that was that, you know, as we were talking about, that her character sort of stressed the idea of harmony in the polarity between men and women. And so, like, I feel like the sort of connection between the two is, like, the idea that these genders are non-complementary structures, which is, like, something that ends up, it's, like, a concept that ends up caving in on itself within the film. Because it's, especially because if you think about, like, the two characters that end up sort of like getting to the end of the film, it's Griff, the cop that's investigating her, and Elaine, the protagonist, and they both kind of represent like gender archetypes in a way, and it's like super unstable. And so like something that I was saying is that like men and women, I don't believe that they're non-complementary, but the problem lies within the roles that genders are forced into playing, and then that in turn seems to like inhibit people from experiencing love in any sort of healthy way, because it's like an act, you know. And I guess that's like kind of goes into a whole nother thing, which we could talk about with like the gender roles of Griff and like the gender roles of Elaine.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest points that I make is comparing the love witch to this concept by Joan Riviere called the Masquerade. And I think that through exploring how the Masquerade fits in with this film, I feel like it helps me understand it so much better. And so hopefully it will make you understand it so much better. A way to sort of explain it, it's this quote by Sean Homer discussing Reviere's concept. He states that women who aspire to masculine or intellectual pursuits arouse fear and anxiety in the very men they wish to be colleagues and collaborators with. Therefore, women who wish for masculinity may put on a mask of womanliness to avert anxiety and the retribution feared from men.
Which is like basically of what, you know, the leader of the coven is like saying when they're in the burlesque club.
Yeah, 100%.
It's exactly like that, you know, like
Yeah.
put on high heels and clothes so you don't scare men, like they can love you in a way that they understand.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I think that, like, you know, something we could sort of talk about later is just, like, the sort of, you know, faults with the Masquerade. But, so, like, basically to sort of break that down, like, we live in a patriarchal society, so it's, like, everything is run by men, you know? Men are the established norm, and everything else deviates from that. So women are broken down and put into boxes because men need to be involved in all important intellectual careers to retain their positions of power. Men are threatened by women because all men have to hold above them is this illusion of the phallus, and that's where the Masquerade comes in. A woman can put herself into that box. She can wear the mask of femininity and pretend to be what men want her to be, so she can gain power by putting on the illusion that there is no threat of gaining power over these men. And I think a lot of that definitely talks more in context to, like, academia and careers, but I think that it translates perfectly into relationships because, especially with straight relationships, there's, like, established gender roles and there's, like, senses of, like, power that are established through that. And not saying that every straight relationship has its gender roles and has its power, but I think that there is... I feel like everybody's sort of, like, brought into this world sort of, like, being forced to understand those things, and you could deviate from them or not, but they exist.
Yeah. I feel like that makes me think of, like, one scene that I feel like is, like, really important in film is the scene wherein Trish and Elaine are in the tea room having tea. Elaine is, like, talking about, you know, like, the fantasy, like, little girl's fantasy. She, like, wants a white knight. She thinks that you should just be men's fantasies. Like, poor, like, you know, Trish talks about, like, not giving her husband whatever he wants. You know, she's a real person. And Elaine's response is like, oh, poor Richard, you know, you don't give him enough attention. You don't, like, sleep with him whenever he wants. And she's like, no, because he loves me for me. And that factors in, like, my wants and needs, you know? It's, like, a really important scene because it's, like, the whole film is, like, basically this idea that, you know, like, little girls are told these fantasies, you know? The way children are treated is so gendered. Like, so few little girls, like, are, like, told to, like, play with action figures. They're, like, told stories about princes and princesses. And, like, it's this fantasy that's, like, carried on throughout the film. Like, another example is, like, the fair scene where her and Griff, Elaine and Griff are at the fair. And there's, like, you know, the royal marriage. And she's literally riding on a horse, a white horse, and he's dressed in a white outfit with a
And
crown.
they're wearing like crowns, like kings and princesses or whatever, princes and princesses.
Yeah, so like Trish is like somebody who like she sees herself like outside of this like idea that Elaine's talking about, but it ultimately is proven false because Elaine's magic seduces Trish's husband, and he proves to be like all the other men who just wants the male fantasy. And when he can't have Elaine, he ends up killing himself.
Something I was also thinking about, I guess this is like a bit of a side note, but like there was like that sort of quote from Bel Air. There's this article from The Guardian where she says that men are known for being much less emotional than women, but in her experience, they're much more emotional, which honestly in my experience as well.
Yeah.
And that's why they won't or can't open that gate for love. It would destroy them. And that's what kills all the men in her movie, having to experience their own feelings. And I think that's like something that we've already discussed, which is like such a present theme within the film. But something I was thinking about upon this watch was that I feel like it's not only their emotions that destroy them, but their need for ownership.
Yeah.
Because so much of what they're saying is like, I need you. And like even when she goes up to Wayne, the professor's cabin, and he's just calling for her all night, and he freaks out whenever she even leaves the room. And it's like clearly an extreme version of that, and I think it's like through the vehicle of magic that like that's why. But I feel like a lot of it is about like not even really love, but just like need for ownership.
Yeah.
And like I feel like something that was like kind of discussed when we were like talking to our roommates about this was that it seems like Elaine like she like wants them, but when they get obsessed with her, she just like doesn't want them anymore. But like I never read it as like her just like being annoyed with their obsession. Yeah. Like I think it's just like she wants love, but she doesn't want to be owned by anyone.
Yeah.
You know? Like there's such like a difference. Like love is like selfless, and like they're just like calling out saying that they need her. Which nobody needs anybody else. Something I kind of want to like expand on that is like something I was talking about was that so when she like invites Richard over for dinner that one night, and she like something that's like super interesting, which like I definitely want to get into, is the idea that she's really good at asking men questions. For them to like boost their ego and talk about themselves, but the funniest thing is that these men think they're in love with her, but they literally don't know anything about her. She not once talks about herself.
Yeah.
And that's something that is also like very interesting. But so like one of the questions that Elaine asks Richard is, what turns you on? And that is something that like really impresses him. So he's like, nobody's ever asked me that before. And he starts like going on this tangent talking about one of his fantasies of like being some sort of renegade and having like a girl by his side that's just like there to look pretty. And like also the idea of like having a wild love affair. And he totally outlines this like super typical male fantasy that's so broad that like any woman can fit into it, you know?
Yeah.
Just like as long as they're beautiful, then like it doesn't really matter who they are, what they want, whatever.
That's like one thing like about the film. is like very humorous. It's just like how campy it is, like, and the use of dialogue is just like so to the point. There's like no subtext. Like everyone says exactly what you expect them to say.
Totally.
Which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and it's like funny because like Trish has this question when they're at the tea parlor that's what do men want, because like that's all Elaine is talking about, and she's just like, oh, just a pretty woman to love and take care of them, and like that's literally his ultimate fantasy.
Yeah.
Like her husband's ultimate fantasy, but you like find out later in the film, and it's like super easy to put on the mask and play that role, because like all it involves is just like suppressing a woman's personality and giving all her attention to a man. So like Elaine can just like fit into that in a snap, because it really doesn't take too much.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it would take a lot out of you to keep that up, you know, to like constantly being like suppressing your own sense of self. But like it's easy to just do that for someone for a night, you know?
I know like a lot of people like said that they felt like it wasn't feminist, or like they didn't agree with the feminism in it. And like I think that like they're like confusing this idea that like Elaine is meant to be some kind of feminist hero. Like she really isn't. But that doesn't mean the film isn't feminist, because it's coming from her like female experience, like her female consciousness. And you know, there's a lot of films which get like hailed as feminist masterpieces, like Wonder Woman, for example. You know, like she's like a feminist hero, but like that's not a feminist film either. You know, it's still for the male gaze.
Yeah.
And like this film is like, even though it depicts this woman who is like doing all these things for men all the time, like the film is like one of the most feminist films I've ever seen.
Yeah, but there's like so many things. I feel like I just kind of want to get into this, was like that there's so many things that the men say throughout the film that are like, I mean, you know, in the grander scheme of things, they're pretty upsetting, but like they're also like hilarious.
Yeah.
In how like upsetting they are, I guess.
Yeah, my first one that comes to mind for me is Wayne, the first man that she like seduces, and they've like had sex, and then he's crying afterwards, and he says, all the women I'm attracted to are too physically aren't bright enough, and all the bright women
are homely
and I'm not attracted to them. Like that's something Ashley says, and I read in an interview with Anna Biller that is something that a male friend of hers actually said.
I've heard that before from men, like 100%. Like men believe that. Like there's a lot of men out there that believe that, and you even hear it a lot in like other forms of media too, like from male characters. And like a lot of times the way it's depicted is that like you're kind of supposed to think he's an asshole, but it's not like he's not the villain of the story, you know? And it's like so totally ridiculous. And like that's like, I feel like that's like another thing that's like said in the film that like encompasses like so many other aspects of it, because like Elaine is beautiful. Like I feel like, you know, I guess that's like subjective, but I think she's like very conventionally attractive. Yeah. And I think she was like clearly chosen for that purpose.
Yeah.
And like her beauty is like so much of like unfortunately the problems that like arise in these relationships that she has. Like I'm not saying that like it's her fault because she's beautiful, because that's fucking stupid, but it's like these men who like see her like something else I was thinking about was when she first meets Wayne at the park, and she's like, oh, well, I love to get outside and be in nature on days like this. And first thing he says, he's like, oh, you love nature? And he's, like, so taken back by, like, that thing that's so ridiculous to me. Because, like, even the thing that he says later, which, like, you know, all the women that he is attracted to are dumb. So, like, whenever he meets, like, a beautiful woman and he finds anything of substance in them, he's, like, so taken aback by it, which is, like, so ridiculous. But it's so true. And even, like, when she's talking to Richard, like, he's just, like, these men are just so easily impressed by literally anything she does just because she's beautiful, and they already have the expectation that she's going to be stupid and shallow.
Yeah.
So, something I want to talk about with you, which I'll get there, but I compare him to Patrick Bateman. I think as much as Bel Air shows Elaine as sort of a delusional character, like, not in any sort of, like, I feel like delusional is, like, a bit of a harsh word, like, especially when talking about, like, female characters, but just, like, has, like, unfortunately, like, gained this, like, false sense of... Do you want to, like, explain this better?
Elaine believes that the way to get love is to be the ultimate male fantasy. And it's this misguided idea.
Yeah, exactly. And so I feel like Griff is sort of this delusional character that's, like, on the other end of the spectrum. And,
yeah, he says, I don't believe anyone can be the ultimate fantasy. You know, no woman can embody that.
Yeah. And, he believes that his decision to not fall in love with women, or allow himself to be vulnerable, see women as, complex humans, like, his decision to, like, not do all those things makes him powerful. So, Griff sort of sees himself as, like, the smart and omnipotent character who's in control of himself and his own destiny. Which is something that I feel like definitely, like, mirrors Elaine's character. But I also think that Griff is so much worse. And so there's that scene when they go on that date and they go to the Renaissance Fair, and it's the fair to celebrate the summer solstice, and there's this internal dialogue that is exposed through voiceovers as they're, like, sitting at this feast and feeding each other grapes. And he says, I want to have an heir someday, and I would need to have a wife. But love is something else. A man can get destroyed by things like that. It's like he's not even a man anymore, which is, like, something he stresses so much, is, like, the need to be a man and his fear of having manhood taken from him. He says, I never want to get that way. The more you get to know a woman, the less you can feel about her. At first, she's this incredible object of mystery who fulfills all your wildest fantasies. Then she starts to reveal little flaws, and after a while, it just gets pretty hard to care. The feminine ideal only exists in a man's mind. No woman can ever fulfill him. It's like what you were saying. Which is so fucked up. He's just, like, so afraid of being vulnerable, about, like, opening up to a woman. Like, the only thing he wants is, like, an empty shell with a pretty face.
Yeah.
And if they show any bit of personality, it's just, the fantasy is destroyed.
Yeah. Which is, like, why they're kind of perfect for each other, because in some ways, because, like, Elaine knows how to be this perfect pretty shell, and that's what he wants, except that, you know.
But I feel like they're not, because she doesn't quite. Like, something I kind of talk about with, like, the idea of the masquerade is that I originally wrote in my essay that I feel like the sort of mask of femininity fits too well for her. But as I watched the movie another time, I kind of realized that it doesn't fit very well. Like, you know, something he sort of, like, calls her out on, which I don't think is, like, okay at all, but he's, like, compares her to a Stepford wife. And as much as, like, I don't think it's, like, true to that extent, I think a lot of the things that she does to seduce these men is very mechanical, and it's clear, and the men, like, do not take any notice of this because they're so attracted to her that they don't see how, like, mechanical and, like, lack of, like, her human character it has in it.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, you know, in a way, it's like the mask doesn't actually fit well. It's just that she's able to get away with it because the men, like, are just blinded by their attraction to her.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But I was comparing it to, like, American Psycho in a way that something I actually found really interesting was, like, I didn't know this until, like, semi-recently, but American Psycho is directed by a woman, and I feel like that makes so much sense in the context of how men are portrayed within that film. And, like, the film is a horror movie, but it's also kind of a comedy, you know? And which I feel like is the same with this film, where, like, these men are, like, portrayed as so ridiculous. And, like, even though it's over the top and campy, there's definitely, like, an element of truth to it.
Yeah.
Like, Griff and, like, Patrick Bateman, like, so obviously, like, possess the phallus. Like, they need this, like, idea of, like, the ideal man, that it's, like, really uncomfortable. Yeah, like, they, like, need to be the alpha male so badly that it's just, like, so uncomfortable to watch, because it's just, like, so, like, disingenuous and, like, desperate.
Yeah.
And so they, like, try so hard to put on this mask of masculinity and make sure it fits, that they become these hard, emotionless robots that have to possess the gaze for fear of losing power or exposing their castration. Like, the way that Griff talks about women is in a way that he doesn't even really want women, you know? Like...
Yeah, like the scene when he's in the precinct and this, like, female cop is, like... She's, like, all over him. She's like, I made your coffee just how you wanted it. And he's like, okay. And then he walks over to there's another guy, and he's like, oh, this coffee's too strong. He's like, I like it this way, you know?
Yeah. And even when, like, I feel like, honestly, him and that other cop, the female cop, have probably never hooked up with each other. But he kind of talks to the other man as if they do.
Yeah.
You know? And I feel like it's all a part of this, like... masquerade in a way. Like, I feel like it almost is like he's asexual, but like he thinks that, like, being attracted to women makes someone a man. And so, like, in a way it sort of shows Griff as, like, borderlining, like, sociopathy or, like, psychopathy in the way that Patrick Bateman, like, fully possesses in that film. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, not to, like, diagnose him or whatever, but, like, it, like, his, like, need to fulfill this role of, like, what he thinks a man is so disingenuous that it feels that way.
I feel like also, like, I think it's, like, a really interesting, like, way that she depicts male gaze in this film, in that way, of it being just, like, so much about, it's, like, the masquerade of being manly. And I was like, in her director's statement, she, like, talks about the idea of the female narcissistic gaze, and that she, like, wanted, like, viewers to experience, like, women to experience. And she was saying how, like, there's, like, an aspect of this in a lot of films which were made for the male gaze. There's also this idea of, like, the female narcissistic gaze and, like, getting pleasure out of it.
But I think that's, like, interesting as well, just because of, like, the whole thing of, like, you know, her, like, doing all these things to her appearance to, like, make herself, like, appear more feminine, and just, like, the sheer amount of attention that she gets for it. Like, there's even a scene when she's, like, walking down the street, and literally every man that passes by her, like, turns back around and checks her out from behind. And it's, like, so over the top and ridiculous, but it's, like, has, like, that element of truth to it, you know?
I really like the way, like, this film depicts, like, feminine labors, you know, like, she puts so much detail and care into, like, these paintings and making these beautiful, perfect cakes and her makeup and her hair. And I think that's, like, something that's really true to Anna Billow, the filmmaker, because she did literally craft all of these things and, like, put labor into it. And, like, also, like, I think it gets back to this idea, like, internalized misogyny of, like, perhaps, like, not agreeing with all of these things which have been that have been labored over, but as, like, being something that, like, you know, is not feminist or something.
Like, saying that, like, the idea of, like, wearing makeup and, like, being really into cooking and baking is, like, not feminist just because it's, like, feminine stereotypes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, like, the real, like, you know, like, issue in the film is, like, the men and this, like, her, like, the fact that she's doing all these things for male attention. It's not, like, the things itself.
And it's, like, funny, too, because I feel like just because of, like, how, like, her sheer beauty, she probably doesn't even need to do all these things that she feels like she understands are, like, what men want, you know? Like, being, like, down for anything, and, like, cooking for them, and, like, comforting them when they cry. Like, she probably, like, doesn't need to do any of that shit. But, like, I feel like the sort of idea of her being so beautiful, and her fulfilling all of these things that are, like, typical male fantasies is, like, what kills them all in the end, because they're just like, I can't handle it. She's too perfect. Something that I think is really interesting is that as you watch, like, Elaine throughout the entire film, you're sort of, like, led to believe that she's just, like, totally misguided, you know, in her attempts to find love and things like that, which I think that she is to a certain extent, but I do believe that when she talks to Griff at the end when they're in the burlesque club, there's a lot of things that she reveals to him that shows that I think she is actually very aware of what she's doing. Because, like, in the beginning, there's that when she's talking to Trish, and she's like, it seems like you're brainwashed by the patriarchy, you know?
Yeah.
But, then when she talks to Griff near the end, when he's, like, confronting her about how, you know, the DNA matches, and she's most likely involved in these deaths of men, she's like, you men, you make us work so hard for your love. If you could just love us for ourselves, but you won't. Then she says, all my life I've been tossed in the garbage, except when men wanted to use my body. So I decided to find my own power, and I found that power through witchcraft. That means I take what I need from men and not the other way around. And so witchcraft in the film is just, like, this vehicle for Elaine to discover her role in society as a woman, and how she can use the masquerade to her advantage without arousing, like, fear and anxiety in men, kind of like what the coven leader was, like, talking about. But then when she, like, reveals like, her use of the masquerade to Griff, there's this sort of horrible backlash that comes with her, like, you know, because the masquerade is used not to arouse fear or anxiety, but when that illusion is shattered, like, when it's revealed that there is this mask, it's gonna arouse fear and anxiety in men, you know? And so that's when, like, the crowd of men at the burlesque club are, like, attacking her, and they're, like, trying to rape her, and they're all screaming, "Burn the witch!" Like, everybody's screaming, "Burn the witch!" You know, when she's taking this mask off and, like, revealing it to Griff and the other men, and, like, revealing that there is a mask of femininity to begin with, then it, like, destroys the mysticism of, like, you know, her being, like, this object that, like, makes men feel like men, you know? And so it's, like, destroying the idea of masculinity itself and, like, bringing about this, like, symbolic castration, you know? And so, like, all these men in the club, like, can't handle that, so they need to destroy her.
Yeah.
Okay, so we want to talk about the symbolism of the tarot cards throughout the film, because I think that witchcraft is a vehicle within the film that's taken very seriously. Even though the film is campy, I think that all of the meaning behind it is real. And so we want to sort of break down the meanings of the readings and how they relate to the film.
And I think, like, it really ties into, like, Elaine's, like, importance that she puts on these, like, tarot cards and, like, you know, fate and destiny and future. And because, like, she's obsessed with, like, her fantasy, like, finding the Prince Charming. You know, she even says, like, when she meets Griff, she's like, "You're the man in the cards." Like, you know, like, she says, "I always thought if I got this card in a reading, it would mean I'm about to meet, like, my husband."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of interesting because when I was reading about it, like, I feel like I don't really understand how she got that.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, there's also a lot of, like, misinterpretation with tarot card readings, you know? Like, a lot of people kind of just see what they want to see.
Yeah.
But as well as that, I think that all tarot card meanings have a light and a dark. I think even ones that sound a lot more negative, sound a lot more foreboding, have elements of hope within them.
Yeah. Like, one that comes up a lot is the Three of Swords.
There is the first part where she gets the Three of Swords. When it goes into her purse. It's seen, like, 3 times within the film, and it's the Three of Swords. So that's kind of interesting. Kind of with what we were saying, actually, with Pie Wacket was, like, I think a lot of belief with, like, magic or the occult kind of comes along with finding patterns in your life and finding the importance within them. And I think that, you know, there's the whole thing with, like, after Leah performs the ritual in the woods in Pie Wacket, and she starts seeing things everywhere that remind her of that ritual and places importance on them, you know? And I think that that's, like, another thing that's shown a lot in this film.
Yeah.
She does a 3-card spread at Wayne's cabin. I don't know if it's in the morning or, like, in the middle of the night. I don't really remember. Her pass card is the Hermit. So the description of the Hermit card is that it is a hermit, clearly. The Hermit stands alone on the top of a mountain. The snow-capped range symbolizes his spiritual mastery, growth, and accomplishment. He has chosen this path of self-discovery and as a result has reached a heightened state of awareness. In his right hand, he holds a lantern with a 6-pointed star inside. It's the Seal of Solomon, which is a symbol of wisdom. As the hermit walks his path, the lamp lights his way, but it only illuminates the next few steps rather than the full journey. He must step forward to see where to go next, knowing that not everything will be revealed at once. In his left hand, the side of the subconscious mind, The hermit holds a long staff. This is a sign of his power and authority, which he uses to guide and balance him. And that is Elaine's past card. Something I thought was interesting about it was how, like, the hermit, especially, like, it's the idea of journeying alone, which I think kind of symbolizes her past as a whole. Like, this idea that she's really only had, like, these experiences with, like, men in her life that don't really know her, aren't really there for her, and so, like, even though she's might be with people throughout her whole life, she's kind of alone. But I also read it as, like, the idea of, like, a path of self-discovery and, like, heightened state of awareness is her finding witchcraft, because that's, like, something that she sort of has discovered, like, before the start of the film. Her present card is the Tower, which I knew kind of about previous to viewing the film. Like, I know that it's a card of cataclysmic change, but I was reading about, like, the symbolism in the card. So the tower, it shows a tall tower perched on the top of a rocky mountain. Lightning strikes set the building alight, and two people leap from the windows, head first and arms outstretched. It is a scene of chaos and destruction. The tower itself is a solid structure, but because it has been built on shaky foundations, it only takes one bolt of lightning to bring it down. It represents ambitions and goals made on false premises. The lightning represents a sudden surge of energy and insight that leads to a breakthrough or revelation. It enters via the top of the building and knocks off the crown, symbolizing energy flowing down from the universe through the crown chakra. The people are desperate to escape from the burning building, not knowing what awaits them as they fall. Around them are 22 flames representing the 12 signs of the zodiac and the 10 points of the Tree of Life, suggesting that even in times of disaster, there is always divine intervention. Like, one of the things I found really interesting was how it says it represents ambitions and goals made on false premises. And I feel like that's something that kind of relates a lot to, like, her goal in the present is, like, what?
To find love?
Yeah. But her sort of, like, goal is, like, made on false premises in a way.
Yeah.
It's like a solid structure on, like, shaky foundations. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And
then the third one is the Three of Swords, which is a future card, but it's also something that she sees. It's, like, the first upright card that's, like, in her bag when she goes to reach for a cigarette in, like, the very first scene. So it's, like, definitely something that carries on throughout the film, what we were saying. It's a very short description for the symbolism in the card. The Three of Swords shows a heart pierced by three swords, representing the pain inflicted by words, actions, and intent on the emotional and physical self. The dark clouds gathering in the background mirror this pain, but offer the hope that just as the storm clouds will disappear, so too will the pain and hurt you are experiencing. So what do you think that's about for her future?
I mean, I think it's, like, about heartbreak, or, like, you know, like, not getting what she wants, which is love. Like, literally a heart stabbed with swords is quite obvious symbolism, I think.
Yeah, and I feel like especially there being, like, three men that she encounters.
Yeah, and it's also, like, a card that comes up in Richard's reading that he has for himself. And when he's, like, heartbroken, crying about the loss of Elaine.
Yeah. And I feel like also, like, the idea of, like, pain inflicted by words, actions, and intent on the emotional and physical self. Like, you know, her future is that, like, she's, like, hurt, like, so much by, like, grifts like masquerade of masculinity, like his willingness to like make her feel like nothing just to like keep his facade.
Yeah.
When like she thinks the whole time that he's the one.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you think was the purpose of everything being so highly aesthetic? Like more than just like her apartment, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think so much of it is like the idea of like recreating this kind of like 60s technicolor, like super vibrant like aesthetic, which I think like the purpose of that is that like I think that Anna Biller is like really trying to, you know, shine a light on like film history in a way in terms of feminism.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think just like the idea of like so much care being put into all of these things, like it's like everything in the film is like through like represents like a labor of like feminine love.
Yeah.
And like that's like her own love that she put into this film, and it's also like representative of like the things that these like women are doing, you know, to express like their femininity. And so I feel like she's like conveying her point even through just like pure aesthetics alone, you know, like these ideas about the masks of femininity and like being feminine, like as like, you know, like for yourself, not for a man.
Yeah. Was there anything new you learned about witchcraft through the film?
I think something I didn't know about was witch bottles, and I liked their use in the film. I also like really like that the witch bottles like leads to this like conversation where the detectives find it and there's like a used tampon in it, and they're like, "What is this?" And Elena says, like in the film, she's like, most men have never seen a used tampon in their lives, and so I feel like that's something that was cool.
Yeah, I love that, like, the used tampon was shown, like, so much, because it kept just, like, flashing around, being like, what is
and then,
this?
Yeah, the detective, like, carrying this bottle of her urine with this used tampon.
Yeah. My third question, which I'm probably going to ask you every time, is, like, what was your favorite, like, cinematography part in the film? Like, your favorite shot or succession of shots?
I feel like it's, like, almost impossible for me to pick, actually, because I think that like this film is shot on 35mm film, and it is so beautiful. And I think like, you know, there's so many like it's like every shot looks beautiful because of like the art direction and the quality of the film and the lighting. You could tell like it was using like techniques that were like true to the past. But one of like my favorite scenes is like probably the scene where she's dancing for Wayne and he's like taking the hallucinogenics and it's all trippy and there's like rainbow flares and stuff, and then she like opens her black jacket and it's just like lined with rainbows, and he's just like it's like too much for him. And like I read that like they use like Dior tights over the lens, like, you know, like these old like techniques that people used to do to like create like an effect like that one, and I think that's really cool.
That's sick.
What was your favorite scene in the film? And least favorite scene in the film?
I feel like I really loved the scene where Elaine is like preparing all of the like magical items that she makes to sell at that store. And she's just like in her beautiful apartment, like making soaps and candles and like bagging herbs. And I kind of like what I was saying with Pie Wacket, just like the idea of like objectively showing like beautiful rituals, I think is like really wonderful to watch. And then also like the Renaissance fair scene, just because I love like the camp of it and like the silly song, like folk songs, and the jester. It's my favorite. And then I feel like I guess my least favorite scene is probably just when Elaine's being attacked in the burlesque club, because it's just like hard to watch.
Yeah. What film would you like recommend people to watch if they liked this film?
Okay, I have 3 picks again because I have trouble narrowing. And I feel like they're all like a bit shocking as choices just because none of them are like aesthetically similar at all, but I think it's more of like the themes and content that I believe can be in some way comparable. My first choice would be The Lords of Salem. So the description of it is a radio DJ in Salem, Massachusetts is plagued by nightmarish visions of vengeful witches after she plays a record by a mysterious group known only as the Lords. And I think the depiction of witches is very different, but I like the sort of idea that it's like this woman who is sort of like fated throughout the entirety of the film. She's like put on this course by powers outside of her control. And I feel like even though the sort of depiction of witchcraft is like very different in the sense that the Lords of Salem seems a lot older than like a modern depiction of witchcraft. It's like the, you know, old witch trial witches being actual witches, and that they praise Satan and stuff, which is usually something I don't really agree with, but I feel like there's something where I think if viewed right, you can see her getting like this sense of freedom and like liberation from these witches, even though they're sort of depicted in a more Christian way. Yeah. You know what I mean? And then another film would be Ginger Snaps. It's a film from 2000. It's about 2 outcast sisters in the mindless suburban town of Bailey Downs. On the night of Ginger's first period, she is savagely attacked by a wild creature. Her wounds miraculously heal, but something is not quite right. So it's a werewolf story. Yeah. It's kind of outlined as your classic werewolf story, but I think that there's something that's like wildly feminist about this film. And a lot of it, I guess as like contrast, has to do with like becoming a woman, like puberty, instead of like being a woman and having like the weight of the experience of being a woman like already on your back. It's sort of them like discovering those things, because you know, Ginger, the main character, she gets her period and she starts transforming, and they kind of show, they use like the idea of a werewolf as like a vehicle for like female sexuality, in a way that kind of can feel monstrous at times, because it's something that people see in you and you feel like you can't control it. You know, I feel like there's times in like every woman's life where like all of a sudden they have matured physically, but maybe they're not like sexually matured yet. But like no matter what, people are going to see you that way, especially men. Yeah. And so I feel like it deals a lot with like the same concepts of just like being viewed in certain ways because you're a woman, because you're like maturing, you know. And then the last one is Teeth, which again, like very, very different in terms of aesthetic and inspiration, but I think deals with a lot of the same concepts of just how men view a feminine woman, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and like the sort of journey of a very naive girl, a very naive woman, being disillusioned by the way she's treated, um, through other people's depictions of her own sexuality.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very liberating film.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like a lot of people could view it as like anti-men, as The Love Witch can, but I think that's kind of a narrow way of thinking. So, yeah.
Well, I was also wanting to say one film that I thought that I recommend is Practical Magic, because even though it's like, you know, Practical Magic is essentially like a 90s romance-esque drama, but I think like there is like actually, the more I was thinking about it, there is like a lot of things that are kind of similar between like The Love Witch and Practical Magic. Well, like Practical Magic isn't very like, you know, challenging in terms of like from a feminist standpoint, but it is like exploring like the idea of like witchcraft and sexuality and persecution because of that, as well as like magic and the role of like women and love. It like explores like all those things. So
Definitely watch it.
yeah. My last question is, if you were going to make a feminist masterpiece, where and when would it be set?
That's a big boy question.
I'm sorry, I need a really grand question.
Okay, so I wouldn't say I wrote a feminist masterpiece, but I did recently write a script that takes place during the Satanic Panic, and for those of you who don't know, it was a time during the 80s and a little bit of the 90s where there was a lot of like fear and paranoia and anxiety that swept the US, about the idea of satanic abuse, about satanic cults, and people thinking that like murders and sexual abuse were like linked to them, and people sort of accusing teachers of young children of involving them in satanic rituals, like involving the children in satanic rituals. And there's people who are still in jail today for being accused of doing these things that are so ridiculous. Clearly we know now that Satanism is not worshiping the devil and sacrificing people. But, you know, there was a narrative at the time, kind of like with when there was a narrative about witches, you know? And I think that although that time wasn't specifically gendered like the persecution of witches was, I sort of thought that it would be a great vehicle to show the persecution of a woman who believed in the occult during this time, like the sort of 80s, early 90s satanic panic, when people could easily see this woman practicing magic and thinking that she's a part of some satanic cult and persecuting her for that. So I guess that would be my answer.
I feel like one thing I want to quote.
Go for it.
To close
End it
up.
with a quote.
She said, "How do you negotiate an authentic self as a woman? It is very difficult. I felt all this backlash against myself being a woman, and I made this movie partly as a response to all the misogyny that I've experienced in my life. But I didn't realize how much misogyny there really was until this movie came out."
And I think with a lot of feminist films as well, It definitely like holds up a mirror, and you're gonna see what you want to see in it, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, we think it's a beautiful film, and it has a lot of really important messages in it, and that we hope that you all can find those messages through your experience of it.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. I'm Natalie.
I'm Marika.
And this is Sorry Is This Boring?
Goodbye.
Peace.